Well, good evening. I'm your host, Robert Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom Hypno Acuity. Tonight's podcast is 7 Ways Why Business Mindsets Encompass a Third World Enslaving Programming. Business mindsets are stuck because most leaders still operate from third world programming they don't even realize they inherited. It's not geographic, it's psychological. It's the old survival logic that says control people, suppress instinct, worship hierarchy, and fear sovereignty. Companies run on outdated obedience scripts, mistaking domination for direction and compliance for competence. They call it leadership, but it's really just scarcity trained insecurity wearing a badge. Isn't outdated, their consciousness is. And we got to raise the consciousness of business and we got of ourselves to communicate. And that's something we really never have. The the consciousness is being able to listen and communicate from where you're at, not where you've been. And that's where business operates from, is from where we've been. Why museum mind stubbornness blocks evolution. Business mindsets stay trapped because they worship the museum mind, the dusty belief that old frameworks are sacred and new perception is dangerous. Museum mind thinking polishes outdated strategies like artifacts, repeating inherited limitations as if the universal truths. It's know-it-all stubbornness that refuses to sense novelty directly because it's too busy protecting its own intellectual relics. Museum mind stubbornness doesn't evolve, it preserves its irrelevance. The spirit frequency veracity, business won't rise until it stops mistaking hierarchy for intelligence, fear for strategy, ego certainty for clarity, stubbornness for strength, credentials for consciousness. Third world programming is the belief that people must be controlled to create stability. Museum mind stubbornness is a belief that knowing is more important than perceiving. Ego pride is a belief that being right is more important than being aware. Together they form the perfect cage, a system that looks professional but thinks primitive. And if you look at the world, how are we still thinking and knowing and operating in primitive ways? Because business and education hasn't modernized. I've been around since 1958, and I observe the world. I observe a lot of primitive ways of doing business. And one thing about business and all the business education, it comes from yesterday and from our ancestors. And something I did last night in the podcast is AI. AI operates from all the collective of our yesterday's knowledge. Trust me, I use AI a lot. I like it when I ask AI a question and it says, "Are you sure you want to ask that? Are you sure about this?" But one thing I understand, when you put it together and you start using your own intuition with AI, your own innovative talents, you can rise out of anything. That's the thing. AI is great, but don't be afraid to put your own intuition, imagination, innovation in the equation. And that's all the thing is in the questions and equations. Why business mindsets are stuck in ancestor third world enslaving programming. Because business mindsets are stuck because most leaders are still running on ancestor programming. And I witnessed that today, very much so. You listen to all these so-called gurus, you can see the ancestor programming. Never wisdom, but survival logic inherited from people who lived in scarcity, fear, and hierarchy. And see, that's something all of our ancestors lived in: scarcity, fear, and hierarchy. And we inherit that in our in our in our inside us. They never realized their leadership styles actually hand-me-down scripts from generations who believed control was safety and obedience was intelligence. And it's really stuck in our museum mind. This is why companies feel like upgraded plantations instead of sovereign, innovative fields. Business is never outdated. Their business lineage is outdated. Why the ego keeps business enslaved, business enslaved in the museum ancestor programming within us. Ego pride keeps business enslaved because leaders are still running ancestor coded scripts that equate control with competence. They never realize their leadership style is just inherited fear logic pretending to be strategy. Savage acumen sees the trap instantly. The ego never leads. It's reenacting old survival reflexes. Museum mind stagnation is the museum mind stubbornness freezes business evolution because worshiping outdated frameworks like sacred relics. Leaders cling to what they know instead of what they can sense, polishing intellectual artifacts instead of perceiving reality. Sassy spirit frequencies, clarity exposes the stagnation. They they were they're not they're never protecting wisdom. They're protecting dust. Sovereign acumen breakthroughs, ego pride, and museum mind thinking. And see, that's something we're really here. We got the ego pride and the ego arrogance. As soon as we hit the end of that, we dissolve yesterday. Ego pride and museum mind thinking enslaved business because they block the sovereign perceptions. Savage acumen breaks through by refusing to bow to hierarchy, credentials, or inherited certainty. It unveils the veracity or the authenticity. Business is never stuck because markets are hard. It's stuck because leaders are loyal to ancestor programming that stopped doing anything for the world a long time ago. They're trying to operate in an egotistical, prideful world, afraid of the authenticity. Why ego pride keeps businesses enslaved without realizing it. Most business cultures are built on egotistical pride, the kind that confuses titles with consciousness and credentials with clarity. Leaders cling to their authority like it's oxygen, terrified of being wrong, terrified of being questioned, terrified of evolving. Ego pride never innovates, it protects its own reflection while pretending to be visionary. Ego pride is never strength, it's fear wearing a suit. How do you see that in the world today? Why museum mind stubbornness blocks evolution? Because business mindsets stay trapped because they worship the museum mind, a dusty belief that old frameworks are scared and new perception is dangerous. Museum mind thinking, outdated strategies like relics, repeating inherited limitations as if they were universal veracity. I use veracity instead of truth because truth has got your viewpoints, opinions, and outdated stuff in it. And you can, when you use veracity, you understand you're aware of what is going on. It's the know-it-all stubbornness that refuses to sense reality directly because it's too busy protecting its own intellectual artifacts. Museum mind stubbornness doesn't evolve, it preserves its own irrelevance. A spirit frequency authenticity. Business won't rise until it stops mistaking hierarchy for intelligence, fear for strategy, ego certainty for clarity, and stubbornness for strength. Credentials for consciousness. That's something I've really awakened of today. We stay the same because we ain't rising in our clairvoyant consciousness. Ancestor programming is the belief that people must be controlled to create stability. Museum mind stubbornness is a belief that knowing is more important than perceiving. Ego pride is a belief that being right is more important than being aware. That one's me, being right instead of being aware. Together they form a perfect cage, a system that looks professional but thinks primitive. Why egotistical pride keeps business enslaved without people realizing it. Most business cultures are built on egotistical pride, the kind that confuses titles with intelligence, credentials with clarity. Leaders cling to their authority like it's oxygen, terrified of being wrong and terrified of being questioned, terrified of of evolving. Ego pride doesn't innovate, it protects its own reflection. It keeps companies stuck in yesterday's logic while pretending to be visionary. Ego pride isn't confidence, it's fear dressed as expertise. While egotistical pride keeps business enslaved, museum, ancestor programming, destroying business consciousness. Ancestor pride enslavement. Ego pride keeps businesses enslaved because leaders are still reenacting ancestor programming, survival logic inherited from people who believe control was safety and hierarchy was intelligence. Savage acumen sees the veracity. Their leadership is just old fear scripts pretending to be strategy, and it suffocates business consciousness before it can rise. The museum mind collapses. Museum mind stubbornness destroys business consciousness by worshiping outdated frameworks like sacred relics. Leaders cling to what they know instead of what they can sense, polishing intellectual artifacts instead of perceiving novelty. Sassy spirit frequency clarity exposes the collapse. They're never protecting wisdom. They're embalming it. Savage consciousness breakthroughs, ego pride, and museum mind thinking enslaves business because they block sovereign perception. Sovereign perception and sovereign awareness will rise you from wherever you're at. Savage acumen breaks through the refusing to bow to the hierarchy, credentials, or inherited certainty. It unveils the core truth. Business consciousness isn't dying from market pressure, it's dying from leaders' loyalty to ancestor programming that no longer fits the world they're trying to operate in. Do you witness that today? This statement or this sentence or whatever, it is total awareness for me. It's sovereign awareness because I realize that today because you can look at the world and we're trying to do exactly the same thing today as we've done for years. So it's us to wake up and stop being loyal to ancestor programming. Why does business education, business educators, and business procedures are, are locked in ancestor stubbornness, afraid of here and now abundance? Ancestor stubbornness traps people. Business education educators stay locked in ancestor stubbornness because they still worship the survival era scripts that equate struggle with virtue. They teach scarcity as professionalism, as fear as strategy. Savage acumen sees the veracity. They're never preparing people for abundance. They're preparing them to repeat the limitations of the past. And where do you witness that in your life? I witnessed it, and it opened me up to a fresh way of life. Museum mind obedience. Business procedures are museum mind artifacts, polished, outdated, defended defended with know-it-all stubbornness. Educators cling to old frameworks because these frameworks protect their authority. Sassy spirit, frequency, clarity exposes the obedience. They're never afraid of abundance itself. They're afraid of losing relevance in a world that no longer needs their relic logic. Abundance fear reflexes. Business systems fear here and now abundance because abundance requires awareness, adaptability, and sovereignty. Qualities ancestor programming never ever was taught or experienced. Savage acumen reveals the core veracity. Abundance threatens every ego-based hierarchy built on control. Certainty and intellectual pride. They never fear abundance because it's risky. They fear abundance because it dissolves their power. This is why the world stuck in business leadership obedience. Ancestor obedience programming. The world is stuck because business leadership still runs on ancestor coded obedience. Several era scripts that taught people to follow authority, never awareness. Leaders reenact old domination patterns because realizing they're performing yesterday's fear logic. Savage acumen sees the truth or the veracity or the authenticity of it, whichever word you desire. Business leadership isn't leading, it's repeating. Business mind leadership. Business leadership worships museum mind certainty, the dusty belief that hierarchy equals intelligence and repetition equals stability. Leaders cling to outdated frameworks like relics, polishing old strategies instead of sensing fresh novelties. Spirit fresh clarity exposes the stagnation. They're never protecting wisdom, they're embalming it in yesterday. Obedience over awareness. The world stays stuck because business leadership rewards obedience over awareness. People rise by complying, never perceiving. They perform professionalism instead of embodying clarity. Savage acumen reveals the core veracity. Leadership isn't failing from lack of talent, it's failing from loyalty to obedient systems. Ancestor, money, all that. Whatever you're obedient to, that fear sovereign minds. Why business and education will lead people to wealth and success is inherited nervous system programming, invented thinking. Why business and education will never lead people to wealth and success because inherited nervous systems and programming, invented thinking, knowing mind museum, looping scripts and receptive patterns of yesterday. Ancestor looping minds. Business and education sell wealth and success, but they actually delivers is ancestor-coded nervous system programming, survival reflexes dressed up as professionalism. They teach invented thinking instead of direct sovereign perception, training people to repeat museum mind scripts instead of sensing lavish, endless abundance. Savage acumen sees the veracity. They never create. They never create leaders. They create obedient replicas of yesterday's fear logic. Museum mind success myths. The promise of success is built on museum mind knowing, outdated frameworks, recycled theories, and intellectual relics. Polished as best practices, business procedures, and education system loops people into repetitive patterns that feel like progress, but are actually just refined obedience. Spirit frequency clarity exposes the myth. The system never elevates consciousness, it embalms it. Savage abundance breaks through as business and education fear authentic abundance because abundance requires sovereign awareness, instinct, and present moment clarity. Qualities. Inherited programming was never taught. They keep people stuck in repetitive thinking because repetition protects hierarchy. Savage acumen unveils the core truth. The world is never blocked on lack of opportunity. It's blocked by systems loyal to nervous system conditioning that can never perceive abundance in the here and now. Why are business leaders operating on outdated institutionalized scripts from indoctrinated education and mind museum enslaving mindsets? Institutionalized obedience because leaders run on outdated institutionalized script because indoctrinated education trained their nervous system to obey frameworks instead of preserve novelty. They were conditioned to trust models over instinct hierarchy and over awareness and repetition and over clarity. Savage acumen sees the veracity. They aren't leading, they're reenacting classroom obedience with corporate costumes. Museum mind leadership. Leaders cling to museum mind thinking because it protects their ego identity. They polish old theories, defend outdated procedures, and worship best practices that were never best. Sassy frequency clarity exposes stagnation. They're never afraid of fresh ideas. They're afraid of losing the authority that comes from knowing old ones. Ancestor programming loops. Business leadership stays enslaved because ancestor programming taught them to control equal competence and certainty equals intelligence. Control equals competence and certainty equals intelligence. They inherited fear logic disguised as professionalism. Savage acumen unveils the core truth. Their leadership is never outdated by accident, it's outdated by lineage. They're loyal to scripts that were designed for survival, never abundance. I've witnessed that in my life right now. That was an awakening right there. Why business management prize dictates to the workforce through mind museum egotistical stubbornness, and I'm right, the workforce is wrong. Pride-driven domination. Business management dictates to the workforce because ego pride has convinced them that authority equals accuracy. Their nervous systems are still running ancestor-coded domination scripts, so they default to "I'm right" even when they're outdated, uninformed, and disconnected from the experience and novelty. Savage acumen sees the veracity. Pride isn't leading, it's compensating. Museum mind control. Management operates from museum mind stubbornness, clinging to old frameworks like relics, treating fresh perceptions as a threat. They polish outdated procedures and enforce them with know-it-all rigidity. Not because they work, because those relics protect their identity. Spirit frequency clarity exposes the pattern. They're not guiding the workforce. They're preserving their own intellectual fossils. Workforce silencing reflex. The workforce is wrong. Reflex comes from institutionalized fear of sovereign minds. Management fears the present moment intelligence of the people actually doing the work because real awareness dissolves hierarchy. Savvy acumen unveils the core veracity. They silence the workforce, not because the workforce lacks insight, it's because the workforce threatens the illusion of managerial superiority. When unrealized wisdom, insight, and clarity flows through the workforce, frontline perception, wisdom flows through the workforce because they're the ones touching the novelty instead of theorizing it. That's what management does, is they theorize what's going on as the people physically doing the work are getting the hands-on wisdom to finish the task. Management actually theorizes everything. Management sits in conference room polishing museum mind frameworks while the workforces sense the living pulse of the business in authentic time. Savage Ackman witnesses the veracity, clarity doesn't come through titles, it comes through get your hands dirty wisdom. Unfiltered awareness, insight rises from the workforce because their nervous systems aren't numbed by ego pride, hierarchy. They aren't trapped in "I must be right" conditioning. They see what's actually happening now, not what the institutionalized script says should be happening. Sassy spirit frequency clarity exposes the pattern. The workforce perceives the novelty, while leadership protects the identity. The sovereign wisdom flows the work as the workforce carries unrealized wisdom through their inner workings because they operate outside the museum mind loops that trap management in repetition. Their awareness isn't present moment, instinct driven and sovereign. Savage acumen unveils the core veracity. The workforce isn't less informed, they're less indoctrinated. The workforce is never less informed, they're less indoctrinated. That's why clarity flows through them first. Why management's pride and egotistical arrogance lower profits, quality of life on the job, and workforce communication. Pride-driven profit leaks. Management's egotistical arrogance lowers profits because pride blocks perception. When leaders operate from I'm right, they stop listening to the workforce, the very people who sense problems first. That pride becomes a profit bleeding reflex, ignoring frontline veracity, rejecting innovation, and suffocating operational clarity. Spirit frequency awareness exposes the core veracity. Arrogance doesn't just hurt feelings, it destroys the quality of life inside the company and drains revenue like a cracked pipe drains water. Arrogance, arrogance, arrogance communication collapses. Egotistical stubbornness shuts down workforce communication because the museum mind managers treat every fresh idea as a threat to their authority. Most management people have a big ego and low self esteem, and they're really afraid of life. The workforce stops speaking, creativity dies, morale collapses, and the entire environment becomes spiritually dehydrated. Savage acumen sees the pattern when leaders cling to being right. The business loses the intelligence of everyone else and the quality of life. The company drops to survival mode scarcity. If you want to see something that's really doing that today, the IBW. I used to be an IBW member, but this one here really made sense. So the the unions are dropping to that survival mode scarcity. Why management's pride in blaming the workforce for the company's challenges lowers profits, quality of life, and workforce communication. Because management blames the workforce and blame driven blind, and then that creates blame driven blindness by the management. Management's pride collapses profits because blame blinds them to the real source of problems. When leaders default to the workforce as the issue, they stop perceiving operational veracity, ignore systematic failures, and refuse to evolve outdated procedure. That blame reflex becomes a profit draining addiction, killing innovation, suffocating morale, and poisoning the quality of life inside the company. Savage acumen sees the truth. Blame is never leadership. It's a nervous system defense mechanism. And I have used that one. Masquerading as authority. The communication death loop. Egotistical arrogance destroys workforce communication because blame shuts the mouths faster than any policy ever could. When management weaponizes pride, the workforce stops speaking and stops sharing insight and stops offering clarity. Creativity collapses, trust evaporates, and the entire environment drops into survival mode scarcity. Spirit frequency awareness exposes the pattern. When leaders cling to being right, they silence the wisdom of everyone else, and the company pays for the silence in profit, morale, and long-term stability. That's something when I was working, the communication, when you got management that was really egotistically arrogant, they were very hard to deal with. And pretty soon they found people, I call them suckasses, and that's all they are. And they could do anything, but if you actually told them what was wrong, they'd get mad. So a lot of businesses challenges is because you're unwilling to listen to the people. Anyway, thank you and good night. Everybody enjoy their weekend. If you got a lot to do in August, you better hurry because the 1st of September is here already.